It was never his intention to think about churches that no longer existed. The subject entered his life quietly, without ceremony, the way obsessions often do. Late at night, while searching through digitized medieval land records, documents meant to define borders, collect taxes, and settle disputes, he noticed something unsettling. Certain names appeared once, sometimes twice, and then vanished entirely. No correction, no clarification, no continuation, just silence where history should have spoken again. At first, the explanation seemed obvious. Medieval scribes were inconsistent, careless by modern standards. Spelling drifted, names mutated, entire places were swallowed by linguistic evolution. But as he continued reading, the pattern became harder to dismiss. These were not minor chapels scribbled into the margins. They were active parish churches, mentioned as administrative centers, responsible for surrounding settlements, collecting obligations, anchoring communities. And yet, after a certain point in time, they ceased to exist on paper. That was when the absence became more troubling than any ruin ever could be. Before continuing, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about missing churches, it's about how entire pieces of history can quietly slip out of human memory without anyone trying to stop it. He began keeping a separate list, not of churches that survived, and not even of churches that fell into ruin, but of churches that left nothing behind at all. No stones, no foundations. No local legends, no place names lingering in the landscape, only a few corrupted words preserved in parchment, disconnected from the physical world they once described. One entry, in particular, refused to be ignored. It appeared in a 14th century ecclesiastical register as a functioning parish. It reappeared decades later in a taxation record, then once more in a traveler's itinerary written in hurried Latin. After that, it vanished. There was no record of destruction, no reference to dissolution, no indication that it had been absorbed into another parish. The church did not transform. It simply stopped being mentioned. Every attempt to locate it led to the same conclusion. Nothing remained. Maps were consulted first, modern ones, then older ones. Parish surveys, archaeological databases. He searched for phonetic variations, dialect shifts, Latinized spellings. He considered whether the name had been shortened, softened, or disguised beneath something more familiar. Each possibility offered hope, and each collapsed under scrutiny. The places that almost fit never quite aligned, close enough to tempt, far enough to fail. Slowly, an uncomfortable realization emerged. History tends to be written around what survives. Stones, walls, monuments, visible scars on the land. Absence is often mistaken for insignificance. But absence can also mean something else entirely. Erasure. Buildings decay. Materials are reused. Fields are plowed. Names fall out of use. And when no one has a reason to remember, forgetting becomes effortless. What unsettled him most was not that these churches had disappeared, but that their disappearance had gone unquestioned. There were no debates surrounding them, no unresolved footnotes, no academic disputes about their location. Their absence had not been treated as a mystery. It had been accepted as if it were natural, inevitable, unworthy of attention. This was no longer about architecture or religion. It was about memory itself, about how easily something once central to daily life could dissolve so completely that even its absence left no trace of concern. If a church, once important enough to define boundaries and obligations, could vanish this thoroughly, then how many others had suffered the same fate? As the list grew longer, the focus shifted. The search was no longer for a single lost building, but for a pattern, a category of disappearance that existed between ruin and survival, a space where history stopped recording, and forgetting took over without resistance. And somewhere beyond that boundary were places no one could point to anymore. Places that had existed, mattered deeply, and then slipped through the cracks of time without leaving so much as a shadow. In the next part, the investigation moves to the first of these locations, or at least to where it should have been, and explores why finding absolutely nothing there may be the most revealing discovery of all. The first location on the list appeared almost offensively ordinary. According to surviving records, the church should have stood between two villages that still existed today, connected by a narrow road whose route had barely shifted in hundreds of years. There were no dramatic explanations waiting to be uncovered, no cliffs collapsing into the sea, no marshland swallowing foundations whole, no historical accounts of fire, war, or deliberate destruction. The land was calm, cultivated, and stubbornly unremarkable. Based on medieval descriptions, the church had once served as a parish center. It collected tithes, marked territorial boundaries, and functioned as a point of reference for surrounding settlements. The documents were specific enough to be unsettling. Streams mentioned in the texts still flowed. Boundary markers still appeared on later maps. Even the road described in one itinerary curved exactly as it always had. If the records were to be trusted at all, the church should have been nearby, perhaps only meters away. Yet the land offered nothing. There were no irregularities in the terrain, no rise in the ground suggesting buried foundations, no scatter of stone where walls might have collapsed. The soil showed no sign of disturbance older than routine agricultural work. Livestock grazed across the fields with complete indifference, unaware that generations earlier, this same ground had been marked as sacred. Local inquiry yielded even less. A nearby landowner, whose family had worked the fields for decades, recalled no stories of a church ever standing there. His father hadn't mentioned one, nor his grandfather. There were no half-remembered legends of a lost chapel, no warnings about plowing too deeply, no names passed down in conversation. The memory of the place had not eroded. It had disappeared entirely. That absence was more disturbing than ruins would have been. Ruins invite questions. They provoke curiosity. They signal that something once stood and fell. But here, there was no invitation at all. The land behaved as if nothing had ever happened upon it, and in doing so, it raised a far more uncomfortable possibility, that forgetting does not always require force. Sometimes it happens simply because nothing resists it. Back in the records, the pattern repeated itself. The church's name appeared confidently in early documents, then grew unstable. A vowel shifted. A consonant softened. In one manuscript, the name seemed squeezed awkwardly between lines, as if the scribe himself was uncertain whether it still belonged there. In later records, it vanished altogether. There was no transitional phase, no downgrade from church to chapel, no merger into a neighboring parish, no note of abandonment. It was as if the place had stepped out of history rather than fallen within it. As more examples were examined, the same quiet disappearance emerged again and again. Churches that were never destroyed in any documented event, churches that were not absorbed, renamed, or commemorated. They simply stopped being written about, and once writing stopped, memory followed. This raised a troubling realization. Historical survival is not a measure of importance, it is a measure of convenience. What survives is what remains visible, useful, or narratively satisfying. What disappears does so quietly, without leaving a story worth repeating. The absence of debate around these missing sites was telling. No scholars arguing over their locations, no footnotes admitting uncertainty, no margins marked with questions. Their disappearance had been accepted as a natural loss, rather than recognized as an unresolved problem. This was no longer an investigation into specific buildings. It was an examination of how history decides what deserves to remain. Somewhere between physical destruction and recorded survival existed a third category. Places that faded without conflict, without witnesses, and without resistance. The more this pattern emerged, the clearer it became that these churches had not simply been lost. They had been overwritten. Fields replaced walls. Farms replaced names. Utility replaced memory. And once a place stopped being useful, remembering it became optional. Standing before land that refused to acknowledge its own past, the investigation reached an unsettling conclusion. Forgetting does not announce itself. It leaves no marker. It produces no ruins. It simply moves forward, confident that no one will stop to ask what used to be there. And if one church could vanish so completely, then perhaps this was not an exception at all, but a rule waiting to be noticed. In the next part, the focus shifts from open fields to names themselves, and how corruption, translation, and careless repetition can distort memory until the original place becomes unrecognizable even on the page. When the land refused to speak, attention turned back to the names themselves. If the physical world offered no trace, perhaps language still carried fragments of truth. Medieval place names were rarely stable. They shifted as languages evolved, as scribes copied unfamiliar words, and as pronunciation drifted across generations. A single letter could change meaning entirely, and in these fragile transformations, entire locations could become unrecognizable. One missing church stood out because of how uncertain its name already appeared in the earliest record. The spelling was awkward, inconsistent, even within the same manuscript. Later copies showed slight variations, as if each scribe had done their best to guess what the original had meant. This instability suggested that the name had already begun to detach from common use while the church still existed. The investigation followed a familiar path. The name was broken apart, examined piece by piece. Prefixes were compared against known ecclesiastical patterns. Suffixes were tested against regional naming conventions. Some elements hinted at saints, others at geographical features, streams, colors, directions. None aligned cleanly. Each hypothesis explained part of the name, but failed to account for the whole. This was not unusual. Names that survive often do so because they remain useful. They describe something visible, a hill, a river, a settlement. But when a place disappears, its name loses context. Without repetition, pronunciation decays. Without relevance, spelling drifts. Over time, the name becomes noise, copied without comprehension until it finally stops being copied at all. Old lists revealed how often this happened. Churches recorded centuries ago appeared under names that no longer corresponded to anything living. Some were clearly distorted versions of known sites. Others floated alone, unanchored, impossible to reconcile with any physical location. The more corrupted the name, the more likely it was that the place itself had already begun to fade by the time it was written down. In one particularly frustrating case, the only potential match existed under a different name entirely, one that shared no obvious linguistic connection. The only link was proximity. The site lay in roughly the same area, within boundaries described in early records. But even there, certainty was impossible. Was this the same church, renamed beyond recognition? Or a different structure altogether, mistaken for the missing one simply because nothing else remained? This ambiguity was not a failure of research. It was a symptom of erasure. When places disappear without documentation, certainty becomes a luxury no longer available. The best that could be achieved was plausibility, and even that rested on fragile assumptions. What made this more unsettling was how casually later sources treated these uncertainties. Some confidently reassigned names without evidence. Others ignored the discrepancies entirely. A missing church would be quietly absorbed into a nearby entry, its identity dissolved to preserve the illusion of completeness. Lists must appear whole, after all. Gaps are uncomfortable. As more names were examined, a pattern emerged. The churches most likely to vanish completely were not the grandest or most isolated, but the ones that existed just long enough to be recorded and not long enough to be remembered. They occupied an in-between space, too ordinary to inspire preservation, too local to attract later interest. Once they ceased functioning, nothing compelled anyone to keep their memory intact. Language, it became clear, was not a neutral record. It was an active participant in forgetting. Each corrupted spelling, each uncertain copy, each assumption made by a later writer nudged the place further from recognition. Eventually, the name no longer pointed to anything at all. This raised an uncomfortable thought. If a place could disappear linguistically before it vanished physically, then erasure began long before the last stone was removed. Forgetting was a process, not an event, and once it reached a certain point, recovery became nearly impossible. The investigation now faced a different challenge. It was no longer about finding where churches once stood, but about identifying the moment they became unstable in memory. The point at which a name stopped being understood and started being guessed. Somewhere in that transition, the church ceased to exist, not in stone, but in meaning. And if names could dissolve this easily, then perhaps the written record itself was far more fragile than assumed. Perhaps history was not a continuous narrative, but a patchwork held together by repetition and convenience. Everything else fell away. In the next part, the search moves beyond names and language to the traces left beneath the surface. Earthworks, disturbed soil, and what little remains when buildings vanish without replacement, leaving only subtle scars for those who know how to look. When names failed and maps offered only approximations, the investigation was forced downward, away from language and paper and into the ground itself. If a church had truly existed and then vanished, it might still have left something behind beneath the surface. Not walls or standing ruins, but subtler disturbances, uneven soil, altered drainage, reused stone, patterns that only appeared when one knew what to look for. Medieval churches were rarely erased cleanly. Even when dismantled, their presence often lingered in small, stubborn ways. Foundations affected how crops grew. Burials disturbed soil composition. Paths formed by centuries of foot traffic resisted complete realignment. These traces were not obvious, but they were persistent. Quiet reminders that land, unlike memory, does not forget easily. Historical surveys occasionally mentioned such remnants, a slight rise in a field. Old stones embedded in a boundary wall. Human bones turned up during plowing. These notes were often dismissed as incidental, unworthy of further study. Yet when examined collectively, they formed a pattern. Many of the missing churches shared the same fate. Dismantled, reused, absorbed into the landscape rather than destroyed. In one documented case, a farmer uncovered cut stone while digging a drainage trench. The stones were later identified as part of a medieval doorway, their carvings worn smooth by time and weather. There was no standing structure nearby, no name attached to the site, and no local memory explaining their presence. The stones were quietly incorporated into a wall and forgotten again. This reuse was common. Churches were valuable sources of dressed stone, timber, and lead. When a building fell out of use, whether through depopulation, administrative changes, or shifting religious practices, it became a quarry. Material was taken not out of malice, but practicality. New houses, barns, and boundary walls rose from the remains of older sacred spaces, carrying fragments of their past into entirely different lives. In some cases, even burial grounds were disturbed. Cemeteries were plowed over once their boundaries were forgotten, bones scattered or reburied without ceremony. The absence of outrage in later records suggested that by then, no one remembered who was buried there, or why the ground had once been treated differently. This was the most unsettling realization so far. Physical traces did exist, but they had been deliberately neutralized, not hidden, not protected, but normalized. Stones became just stones, fields became just fields. The land adjusted, and people followed suit. Archaeological databases occasionally preserved brief acknowledgments of these sites, a single sentence noting possible ecclesiastical origin, a footnote suggesting former chapel location uncertain. These entries rarely attracted further attention. Without visible ruins or clear documentation, there was little incentive to investigate deeper. And yet, these faint traces were often all that remained. What distinguished these vanished churches from those that survived as ruins was not significance, but timing. Churches abandoned earlier were dismantled when reuse was still expected. Later ruins, by contrast, benefited from changing attitudes toward preservation. Romanticism, antiquarianism, and modern archaeology all played roles in deciding which structures were allowed to decay visibly and which were quietly erased. In this sense, survival was not a matter of importance, but of historical luck. The investigation began to resemble a map of selective memory. Churches that survived long enough to be noticed by preservation movements gained protection. Those that disappeared earlier were absorbed into everyday life so thoroughly that questioning their absence seemed pointless. The ground, however, told a different story. Even when stripped of walls and names, it retained irregularities, slight elevations, unusual soil composition, patterns of reuse visible only in hindsight. These were not enough to reconstruct the past, but they were enough to confirm it had existed. Yet accessing these traces required intent. Without someone actively looking for them, they remained invisible. And this raised a troubling implication. History does not preserve itself. It requires witnesses, curiosity, and effort. Without those, even physical evidence fades into the background of daily life. At this stage, the investigation reached a quiet turning point. The churches had not vanished mysteriously or violently. They had disappeared through ordinary processes: reuse, neglect, convenience. Forgetting had not been imposed. It had been allowed, and that made the disappearance more unsettling, not less. Because if sacred spaces could be reduced to building material and farmland without resistance, then memory itself was far more fragile than assumed. Not erased by catastrophe, but worn away by usefulness. In the next part, the focus shifts from the land to the people, or rather, to the absence of people. Parish records, congregations, and the human networks that once sustained these churches, and how their quiet dissolution made forgetting not only possible, but inevitable. If land and language could forget, it was only because people had done so first. Churches did not exist in isolation. They were sustained by congregations, by routines repeated weekly, by births, marriages, burials, and obligations that bound communities together. When a church disappeared completely, it was never just the building that was lost. It was the network of people who had once given it meaning. Parish records revealed this process more clearly than stones ever could. In areas where churches survived, registers continued uninterrupted. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, written in steady succession. But in the regions surrounding the missing churches, these records grew thin, then erratic, and finally ceased. Names stopped repeating. Family lines fractured or relocated. Entire clusters of activity dissolved without explanation. This was not sudden depopulation caused by plague or famine, at least not exclusively. Instead, it appeared gradual. Farms consolidated. Smaller settlements merged into larger ones. Administrative boundaries shifted. When that happened, parish life followed convenience rather than tradition. People attended churches that were closer, larger, or more stable. The old church, once central, became optional, and once optional, it became vulnerable. Without a congregation, a church lost its purpose. Without purpose, maintenance stopped. Without maintenance, decay accelerated. At no point did this require a decision to abandon memory. It happened simply because nothing intervened. What remained in the records were hints of this slow dissolution, notes indicating reduced tithes, mentions of clergy reassigned elsewhere, occasional references to former parishes, without elaboration. The language was administrative, indifferent. It recorded outcomes, not emotions. This absence of reaction was telling. The loss of a church did not always provoke outrage or grief. In many cases, it passed unnoticed, absorbed into the rhythms of everyday survival. When resources were scarce and priorities shifted, preserving an unused building was not a concern. The living always outweighed the symbolic. Over time, even memory adapted. New generations grew up attending different churches. They married, baptized their children, and buried their dead elsewhere. The old site faded from lived experience. Stories stopped being told, not because they were forbidden, but because they were no longer relevant. Eventually, no one remained who had ever set foot inside the building. At that point, forgetting was complete. What made this particularly unsettling was how clean the process was. There were no dramatic final moments, no last services recorded, no laments preserved in writing. The church did not end. It simply ceased to matter. And in a historical record shaped by what mattered most, that was enough to erase it. This revealed an uncomfortable truth about memory. It is communal before it is historical. As long as people remember together, places persist. Once collective memory fractures, written history follows. Documents alone cannot preserve meaning without living context. The missing churches were not destroyed by neglect alone. They were undone by the disappearance of shared attention. Even saints associated with these places suffered the same fate. Some names appeared only once in hagiographies or marginal notes, attached to churches that no longer existed. Without a physical site to anchor devotion, the saints themselves faded from recognition. Their feast days vanished. Their stories stopped circulating. Eventually, even their names became uncertain. This raised a troubling possibility that history does not simply forget places, it forgets identities. The investigation now suggested that disappearance occurred in layers. First, attendance declined, then administration shifted, then maintenance stopped, then language grew unstable. Finally, the land absorbed what remained. At no stage was forgetting intentional. It was the cumulative result of practical decisions made without concern for legacy. Seen this way, the missing churches were not anomalies. They were casualties of ordinary life. And this realization changed the tone of the search. The question was no longer where these churches had gone, but when they had crossed the threshold into irrelevance. The precise moment when remembering them stopped being necessary. Once that moment passed, recovery became nearly impossible. In the next part, the investigation turns to the final and most fragile witnesses of all: lists, inventories, catalogs compiled by people who assumed they were recording permanent knowledge, and how even these attempts at preservation failed to protect the churches from slipping into obscurity. By this point, the investigation had narrowed to a fragile final thread: the lists themselves, inventories, registers, catalogs created by people who believed they were preserving something permanent. If churches could vanish from land, from language, and from communal memory, then these lists represented the last defense against complete erasure. And yet, even here, certainty began to fracture. The earliest lists were deceptively confident. Names were written cleanly, often without explanation, as if their existence required no justification. The compilers assumed a shared understanding between writer and reader, a world where these places were known, visible, and unquestioned. No descriptions were needed, no locations clarified. Why explain what everyone already recognized? But that assumption did not survive time. As centuries passed, later lists copied earlier ones, sometimes faithfully, sometimes carelessly. Errors crept in, spellings drifted, marginal notes were misinterpreted as official entries, names were duplicated, merged, or truncated. In some cases, a single church appeared twice under different spellings. In others, several distinct churches collapsed into one ambiguous entry. Most troubling of all were the names that appeared only once. These entries stood alone, unsupported by later confirmation. No footnotes questioned them, no explanations followed. They simply existed in a single document, frozen in ink, and then vanished from all subsequent records. For a long time, historians treated these as mistakes, scribal errors, misreadings, or references to places that never truly existed. But the pattern was too consistent to dismiss. These isolated entries tended to cluster geographically. They appeared alongside churches that were known to exist. They followed the same organizational logic. They were written with the same confidence as everything else on the page. There was no indication that the compiler doubted their reality, which raised a troubling question. If these were errors, why did they look so deliberate? The possibility emerged that these lists were not recording permanence, but transition. They captured a moment when certain churches still existed, barely, on the edge of irrelevance. Places that were still known to the compiler, but already slipping from wider recognition. The lists were not monuments, they were snapshots taken just before disappearance. This reframed the entire investigation. Rather than viewing the lists as flawed records of a stable past, they could be understood as documents of loss in progress. They preserved names at the exact moment when nothing else would, and yet, even this preservation was incomplete. Later scholars, encountering names they could not reconcile with physical sites, often resolved the problem by omission. In revised catalogs, uncertain entries were quietly removed or absorbed into nearby locations. The logic was practical. If a church could not be found, it was safer to assume it never existed than to acknowledge uncertainty. In doing so, the last remaining trace disappeared. This revealed something deeply unsettling about historical preservation. It was not neutral. It favored coherence over accuracy, completeness over honesty. A clean narrative was preferable to an unresolved one. The missing churches fell victim to this preference. They were inconvenient. They complicated the map. They resisted explanation, and so, over time, they were edited out. Not maliciously, but efficiently. Their absence became easier to accept than their ambiguity. At this stage, the investigation reached its most uncomfortable conclusion. The churches had not merely been forgotten by accident, they had been forgotten by design. Not through conspiracy, but through methodological convenience. History had chosen clarity over truth. The lists that once preserved them had become tools of erasure. This realization shifted the focus inward. If these churches could vanish despite being written down, what did that say about the reliability of recorded history as a whole? How much of what was assumed to be complete was merely what survived scrutiny? The investigation no longer felt like a search for missing places. It felt like a confrontation with the limits of historical memory. Each list now read differently. Names once skimmed over demanded attention. Gaps became meaningful. The absence of explanation was itself a form of evidence. Silence was no longer empty. It was loaded. And within that silence, the churches remained. They existed not as buildings, nor even as confirmed locations, but as unresolved questions, as reminders that the past was not as orderly as later generations preferred to believe. This understanding carried an unexpected emotional weight. The churches had once been full of sound. Bells, voices, prayers, footsteps. They had marked time, structured weeks, gathered communities. Now, they survived only as ink marks that no longer pointed to anything tangible. Yet they were still real. The realization lingered. Existence does not guarantee remembrance. Being recorded does not ensure survival. And disappearance does not require catastrophe. It only requires time, convenience, and the absence of resistance. By the end of this stage, the investigation had exhausted every external source. Land offered nothing. Language distorted meaning. People had moved on. Lists failed to protect what they recorded. There were no new leads to follow. Only one question remained. If these churches were gone in every practical sense, physically erased, linguistically corrupted, socially forgotten, what did it mean to remember them now? Did naming them again restore anything? Or was this act of attention merely symbolic, a gesture without consequence? The answer was unclear. But one thing was certain. The churches had crossed a threshold. They no longer existed in the world, but they had not entirely ceased to exist in thought. They occupied a narrow space between memory and oblivion, and standing at that boundary was the investigator himself, forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that remembering something too late may not save it, but forgetting it entirely would guarantee its final death. The final part turns away from the records and toward that question. Not where the churches went, but what their disappearance reveals about memory, meaning, and the quiet way history decides what deserves to remain. At this stage, the investigation no longer progressed in straight lines. What had begun as a methodical search, maps, names, land, people, lists, started looping back on itself. Each answer exposed another absence. Each clarification revealed a deeper uncertainty. The churches were no longer just missing. They had become structurally unreachable, existing only as gaps in otherwise orderly systems. What unsettled the investigator most was not the number of missing churches, but how normalized their absence had become. In academic writing, uncertainty is often framed as temporary, something to be resolved with further research. But here, uncertainty appeared permanent. There were no new sources waiting to be uncovered, no hidden archives, no overlooked ruins that would suddenly restore clarity. The limits had been reached. And yet, the sense of incompletion persisted. The investigation shifted inward, not emotionally, but structurally. It began to examine itself as a process. Each method had failed in a different way. Physical evidence had been reused or erased. Language had distorted meaning. Communities had dissolved. Lists had simplified complexity into coherence. What remained was not ignorance, but an accumulation of partial truths that refused to align. This raised an uncomfortable realization. Perhaps the expectation of resolution was the real illusion. History, as commonly presented, implies that the past can be reconstructed with enough effort. That gaps exist only because research is incomplete. But the missing churches suggested something else entirely. They pointed to losses that were not recoverable, not because of negligence, but because forgetting had been thorough and unopposed. In this light, The investigation itself began to resemble the objects it pursued. It circled names that no longer anchored to places. It traced boundaries that no longer defined anything. It depended on sources that assumed shared knowledge no longer available. The work was built on fragments, and fragments resisted synthesis. Even the act of categorization started to break down. Were these churches lost, destroyed, misrecorded? None of the labels fit cleanly. Each implied an event or intention that could not be demonstrated. The most accurate description, that they had simply ceased to matter, felt unsatisfying, almost offensive in its simplicity, yet simplicity often hides truth. The investigator noticed a pattern in how modern scholarship dealt with these cases. When confronted with unresolved sites, researchers tended to move on quickly. Papers mentioned them briefly, then returned to topics that allowed firmer conclusions. The missing churches became footnotes, then omissions, not because they were unimportant, but because they resisted narrative closure. Narratives, it seemed, required endpoints, beginnings and endings, causes and consequences. The missing churches offered none of these. They occupied a liminal state, documented but unverifiable, significant but unrecoverable. This liminality made them uncomfortable to handle. As the investigation dragged on, time itself became distorted. Days were spent rereading the same entries, scrutinizing the same marginal notes, tracing the same roads on maps that offered no answers. Progress was measured not in discoveries, but in confirmations of absence. Each confirmation carried weight, reinforcing the idea that something real had been lost beyond recovery. What troubled the investigator most was how easily attention could drift away. After hours immersed in missing places, stepping back into the present felt jarring. Modern life functioned without reference to what had been erased. Fields produced crops, villages expanded, roads carried traffic. The world did not pause for what had disappeared beneath it. This indifference was not malicious. It was efficient, and that efficiency raised a broader question. If entire churches, once central to community life, could vanish without consequence, what else had been lost the same way? How many institutions, practices, beliefs, and people had slipped out of collective memory simply because nothing required their preservation? The investigation began to hint at a much larger pattern. The churches were not unique, they were examples, visible only because they had once been recorded. Countless other places and experiences, never written down, had likely vanished even more completely. This realization carried a subtle psychological toll. The search no longer promised discovery, only accumulation. Each missing church added to a growing sense that the past was far less intact than commonly assumed, that history was not a solid structure with a few cracks, but a porous surface riddled with voids. And still, the work continued. Not because resolution was expected, but because attention itself had become meaningful. To name the missing churches again, even without certainty, felt like resistance, not against forgetting, because forgetting had already occurred, but against indifference. Against the idea that what could not be recovered was not worth acknowledging. This act of attention did not restore the churches. It did not rebuild walls or resurrect congregations, but it altered the relationship between the present and the absence. The missing places were no longer silent. They had been noticed. Yet this too raised a troubling question. Was this attention enough, or was it merely symbolic, a temporary interruption before forgetting resumed? The investigation offered no answer. It simply revealed the question. At this point, the missing churches no longer functioned as subjects of study. They had become mirrors, reflecting the fragility of memory, the selectivity of preservation, and the quiet mechanisms by which history simplifies itself. They exposed how easily complexity is smoothed away in favor of coherence. And somewhere within that realization, a deeper unease took hold. If remembering something too late does not save it, then what is the value of remembrance at all? The investigation had not yet reached its end. There were still more names to examine, more patterns to test, more silences to confront. But it had crossed a threshold. It was no longer about finding answers. It was about understanding the shape of loss itself. The next part does not resolve this tension. Instead, it turns toward a more intimate scale, toward the idea of memory as a personal burden, and what happens when the act of remembering begins to change the one who refuses to let go. At some point, the investigation stopped behaving like research and began to resemble a burden, not an emotional one in the conventional sense. There was no grief, no nostalgia, but a quiet pressure that settled into routine. The missing churches were no longer objects of curiosity. They had become fixtures of thought, recurring whether invited or not. What changed was not the evidence, but the way attention lingered. Names once examined methodically now resurfaced unprompted. While reading unrelated material, fragments of corrupted spellings appeared in the margins of the mind. Place names that no longer existed began to feel strangely familiar, as if they were unfinished thoughts rather than historical artifacts. This familiarity was unsettling. It suggested a form of attachment forming not to places themselves, but to their absence. The investigator became aware that remembering was no longer neutral. Each act of recall carried a weight. To hold these vanished churches in mind meant accepting their isolation. No one else was thinking about them. No community remained to share the memory. The act of attention had become solitary, almost private. In this sense, the investigation inverted its original purpose. What began as an attempt to recover lost history now highlighted the loneliness of remembering something no longer connected to the present. Memory, stripped of social reinforcement, became fragile. It required constant effort to maintain. This raised an unexpected question. Who is memory for? Historical preservation is often justified as a service to future generations, but in these cases, the future had already moved on. The missing churches had no advocates, no descendants demanding recognition, no cultural momentum sustaining interest. Remembering them served no obvious function beyond the act itself. And yet, abandoning the search felt wrong. There was a subtle shift in how time was experienced. The past no longer felt distant. It felt adjacent, close enough to touch, but impossible to enter. The investigation existed in a suspended state, neither moving forward nor backward, looping through the same fragments with increasing familiarity. Even language began to lose clarity. Words like lost and forgotten no longer seemed adequate. Loss implied something mourned. Forgetting implied carelessness. Neither fully captured what had happened. These churches had not been actively removed from memory. They had simply been outpaced by time. The investigator noticed how easily modern life accommodated this erasure. Digital maps updated seamlessly. Administrative boundaries shifted without reference to older ones. Infrastructure projects progressed without hesitation. The land was efficient, productive, and forward-facing. There was no space in its logic for acknowledging what no longer served a purpose. And yet, traces remained. Not in the ground, but in perception. Certain landscapes began to feel incomplete. Fields appeared too smooth, too resolved. The absence of ruins became conspicuous. Where decay might have invited imagination, there was only uniformity. It was not that something felt wrong, but that something felt missing without any clear indication of what it was. This sensation resisted articulation. It could not be documented or cited. It existed only as awareness, a quiet recognition that the present was built atop layers of absence that had never been acknowledged. The investigator began to wonder whether this was the true legacy of the missing churches, not their physical remains nor their names in lists, but the subtle distortion they left behind. A landscape that functioned perfectly while concealing its own incompleteness. Memory, in this context, became an act of defiance, not against destruction, but against smoothness, against narratives that presented history as continuous and resolved. To remember what had been erased was to introduce friction into that narrative, but friction came at a cost. Holding these absences in mind began to alter perception. The investigator found it increasingly difficult to encounter historical certainty without skepticism. Every confident statement about the past now seemed provisional. Every preserved monument implied countless others that had not survived long enough to be noticed. This skepticism was not cynical. It was careful. It acknowledged that preservation was selective, and that survival did not equate to importance. What endured did so because conditions allowed it, not because it deserved to. The missing churches embodied this truth uncomfortably well. They were not grand enough to protect, not dramatic enough to mourn, not useful enough to maintain. Their disappearance required no catastrophe, only the passage of time and the absence of resistance. In recognizing this, the investigation reached a deeper layer. It was no longer about reconstructing what had been lost, but about confronting how memory itself operates, what it preserves, what it abandons, and how easily the latter becomes invisible. The burden, then, was not sadness, but awareness. To see absence where others saw continuity was isolating. Conversations about history now felt incomplete, even misleading. There was an urge to interrupt, to qualify, to point out what was missing, but doing so would require explaining absences that could not be proven. Silence, once again, prevailed, and yet, something unexpected emerged from this isolation. The act of remembering, even privately, created a connection, not to the past as it was, but to the reality of loss itself. The missing churches became symbols, not of failure, but of fragility. They demonstrated how easily meaning could dissolve without violence or intention. This understanding did not resolve the investigation, it deepened it. The question was no longer whether the churches could be found, but whether remembering them changed anything at all. Did attention restore dignity to what had been erased? Or was it merely a personal ritual, comforting but inconsequential? The investigation offered no answer. It only clarified the stakes. Remembering was not about saving the past. It was about resisting the ease with which it could be forgotten. The next part does not provide closure. Instead, it turns toward the present, toward the implications of living in a world built atop unacknowledged absences, and what it means to move forward while knowing how much has quietly slipped away. At the end of the investigation, there was no revelation waiting to be uncovered. No final document, no forgotten map, no last stone turned that suddenly restored clarity. The absence remained intact, and perhaps that was the only honest conclusion possible. The missing churches never returned to the landscape. They did not rise again through discovery or reinterpretation. They remained what they had become long ago. Places that once existed, once mattered, and now survived only as unresolved references. Names without anchors, locations without coordinates, memories without witnesses. This realization reframed everything that had come before. The investigation had not failed. It had simply reached the boundary of what could be recovered. Beyond that boundary lay not ignorance, but acceptance, an acknowledgement that some losses were complete, and that no amount of attention could reverse them. Yet something had changed. The churches were no longer invisible. They existed now as absences that had been named, traced, and acknowledged. They were no longer smooth gaps in history, unnoticed and unquestioned. Their disappearance had been made visible, not through reconstruction, but through recognition. And that recognition carried weight. What lingered most was not the buildings themselves, but the process that erased them, the quiet efficiency with which memory yielded to practicality, the way usefulness replaced significance, the ease with which meaning dissolved once repetition stopped. These were not exceptional circumstances. They were ordinary mechanisms, operating continuously, shaping what endured and what did not. The churches had not been destroyed by enemies or disasters. They had been outpaced. Time did not attack them. It simply moved on. This was the uncomfortable truth revealed by the investigation. That history is not a complete archive, but a selective surface. That survival is often mistaken for importance. And that countless lives, places, and practices vanish, not because they lacked value, but because nothing required their preservation. Standing at the end of this inquiry, the investigator understood that remembering was not an act of rescue. It was an act of resistance. Not resistance against forgetting entirely. That was impossible. But resistance against indifference, against the assumption that what cannot be recovered does not deserve acknowledgement. The missing churches occupied a narrow space between memory and oblivion. They were not fully remembered, but no longer entirely forgotten. And in that space, they took on a different kind of meaning, not as physical structures, but as reminders of fragility, of how easily the past slips away when attention shifts elsewhere. There was a strange humility in this conclusion. It stripped history of its certainty. It replaced confidence with caution. Every preserved monument now implied countless others that had not survived long enough to be noticed. Every intact narrative suggested layers of omission beneath it. This did not diminish what remained. It contextualized it. The investigation ended where it began. Not with answers, but with awareness. Awareness that the past is incomplete, that memory is selective, and that disappearance does not require violence or intention. It only requires time, convenience, and silence. In acknowledging this, the missing churches achieved something unexpected. They became present again, not in stone or soil, but in thought. Their absence gained shape, their loss gained meaning, and perhaps that was the most that could be done. Because remembrance does not restore what has been erased. It changes the relationship between the present and the past. It introduces hesitation where certainty once stood. It reminds those who look closely that beneath every field, every road, every orderly map, there may lie something that once mattered deeply and was allowed to fade. The churches were gone, but their disappearance now spoke. And that voice, however quiet, refused to be entirely silenced. And you, who followed this story all the way to the end, what do you think? Do you believe that places can truly disappear if no one remembers them? Leave your opinion in the comments, because questions like this are still relevant in a world that moves forward faster than it remembers. If this story made you think, moved you, or left you uncomfortable, share this video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are still many stories like this. Stories that explore what history forgets, what memory abandons, and what quietly disappears when no one is looking.